Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's really a great honor to have been invited to speak at this NAF seminar. But very much to my regret and due to unforeseen circumstances, I'm unable to attend in person. So I would like via this channel to speak about governance, both private and public, and complexity. Many companies, governments and organizations, and also people individually, feel that traditional tools, methods of control frequently are not as effective in current circumstances as they were in the past. Whether it is, for example, quantitative risk management, setting a precise strategy in the private sector, or, for example, targeting a certain level of inflation via steering interest rates by central banks in the public sector. And how to deal with issues like climate change, cybersecurity, traffic safety, migration flows, development of cities, regions and countries, worldwide poverty and personal development. This problem of felt lack of control seems to be related to increased globalization and digitization of our world. Or in other words, it is related to high interconnectedness, combined with realizing that the future is uncertain. And my claim here today is it has indeed to do with the fact that the world is complex and the future is uncertain. However, and that's where the tension is, we look at the world as if it is not complex and as if it is not uncertain. We are using planning and control techniques which assume a simple world where uncertainty doesn't matter. We need to act in the world, take decisions and make choices on the basis of another paradigm. A paradigm that assumes complexity and the existence of uncertainty. What I will do in the remaining of this talk is to first define complexity and uncertainty, and then explain what taking these phenomena, complexity and uncertainty, seriously implies for being effective in today's world. And effective meaning being able to seize opportunities and to be able to cope with and respond to threats. I will, in that context, discuss 5 important strengths and 5 policy principles for acting in a complex and uncertain world. But as said, first to the definitions of complexity and uncertainty. First, what do I mean by complexity? First element of it is that we have to do with a great number of heterogeneous, interacting individuals who are also responding to each other and to their environment. So complex human systems are adaptive systems. A second element of complexity is, and human complexity is, that it is impossible to collect centrally all the dispersed knowledge and information that is needed to know to determine the actual state of the system at any point in time. So that's the definition of complexity. Let's look at a short video about an ecosystem. And an ecosystem is also a complex system and also a complex adaptive system. Just to make more clear, to show what a complex system is. So after having talked about complexity, let me now move on to uncertainty. And uncertainty has to be distinguished from risk. And let me first describe what risk is, how we define a situation of risk. And a situation of risk is a situation in which we know all the potential or possible outcomes of a certain action or of a certain decision. And the most simple example is flipping a coin. Flipping a coin has two potential outcomes. It can be heads or it can be tails. You don't know in advance which outcome it will be, but it's definitely one of these two. If you are in a situation of uncertainty, distinguished from risk, you do not know all the potential outcomes of a certain action or a certain decision. Now the point is that part of the human condition is that we live in a situation and we have to take decisions and we have to act in a situation of uncertainty rather than in a situation of risk. And this is inescapable. It's part of the human condition. Because we cannot know now what we will discover or what will be discovered in the future. But future discoveries will impact the outcome of decisions and actions that we take now. And therefore, by definition, the future is uncertain rather than risky. Let's again look at a short video which elaborates a little bit on what uncertainty means in real life.
See, let's understand this. See, this is all it is. There are many uncertainties. I may be very good driver, but still I can hit something or something can hit me. Always this chance is there, do you understand? This chance is always there with every aspect of life, not just with road. So the problem is, because you don't have the courage to handle it, you want to know what will happen tomorrow. If you want to know what will happen tomorrow, one thing that will happen to you is, you will not play today's game well. Yes. And essentially you are a match fixer. That is, you want to know the result before you play the game, you are a match fixer, isn't it? Right now it is for match fixing in India there is a 10-year imprisonment. So before you get married, you want to know whether you live joyfully or not. Arey? You have to get married, you have to take responsibility for each other and see that it works. There is no magic to it.
Now, having defined complexity and uncertainty, the question is, what does it mean if we take a paradigm in which we look at the world from the perspective of the assumption that the world is complex and uncertain? What insights can be derived from that as a basis for our action in today's world, in the modern world as it is? And I would restrict myself to what I think is the most important insight from that complexity paradigm. And that insight is that there is always potential surprise. There's always potential for positive surprise, let's say opportunities, but also for negative surprise. Let's call it threats. There's always the potential for mistakes, there's always the potential for errors. So that's the main insight that follows from looking at the world through the lens of complexity. as said earlier, there are 5 strengths that can help you as a person, as a team, as a department, a company, a government, to be effective in the modern world, in the world as it is, complex and uncertain. The first strength is alertness. And alertness in this context is the capacity to detect surprises. So the paradigm says that there is potential for surprise. Alertness is a capacity to then be also able to find surprises. The second strength to develop in the modern world and to be effective in the modern world is resiliency. And that is the capacity to remain viable, to survive negative surprises. Third capacity is adaptivity. That's the capacity to respond to surprises. The fourth strength is creativity. And in this context, creativity means the capacity to generate surprises, the capacity to co-shape the future. And finally, an important strength is being entrepreneurial. Defined, again, through the complexity lens, as a capacity to pursue objectives by continuously following a feedback process of planning, executing, reviewing, and adapting. Planning, executing, reviewing, and adapting, and so on and so forth, permanently. These are 5 important strengths that help you in the modern, complex, and uncertain world. Now note that stability, often mentioned as an objective of policies, is not mentioned, has not been mentioned by me as a strength. And I would even go a step further. Stability is not even always a desired outcome, because resilience and adaptivity mean that you sometimes have to change. You have to adapt to surprises. You have to cope with them. And that's almost the opposite of stability. Let me now zoom in a little bit more, or look at it from the policy perspective, and economic policy in particular. And in that context, the alternative paradigm, the complexity paradigm, or a paradigm in which you take complexity and uncertainty seriously, leads to, again, 5 principles. 5 principles for effective, for desirable policy in a complex and uncertain world. The first principle is what I would call the principle of modesty. And that principle is derived from the work of the great economist Friedrich von Hayek. And basically, that principle says that you should never pursue objectives that are beyond your reach, that you really cannot achieve. It says, don't try to achieve in a complex world very specific and precise outcomes, but create conditions which make the achievement of your objectives more likely. So that's the first principle. Try to create the right conditions rather than to achieve specific outcomes. Second important policy principle is the principle of do no harm. And perhaps people working in the area of medicine recognize this principle because it's a principle that's often found in medical oaths. And some even claim that it goes back to Hippocrates centuries ago. What does that principle say, and what does that principle mean? It basically says, first of all, that you should be aware that you know very little about the actual day-to-day and detailed functioning of a complex system. And a human body is also a complex system. And an economy, of course, certainly is, and society certainly is a complex system. There's very little that you can know in detail of the actual functioning of such a system, and you should be aware of that. Secondly, as we have already seen, in such a system there is adaptive capacity. And so this principle says, give that adaptive capacity room to operate. Don't hinder it by your policy actions. Don't do more harm than good. Don't be a source of unpredictability yourself. And the yourself here is the policy maker or the politician. So that's the do no harm principle. The next principle can be based on two statements. And both of them come from the well-known, the famous economist John Maynard Keynes. The first statement I'm referring to is a statement that comes from his book, A Tract on Monetary Reform. And that statement, it's a famous statement, is, in the long run, we are all dead. Second statement, coming from his famous book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, is don't attach too much weight to matters which are very uncertain. So what does that mean? What do these two quotes, what do they mean if we bring them together? First of all, in the long run we are all dead statement basically says, if you have a problem today, do not assume that it will automatically solve itself, but act today and don't wait until the long run. He also said, to illustrate this further, if you are in a storm on a lake and you have to cope with that, it doesn't help you very much if somebody tells to you, just wait, because we know that after the storm the lake is quiet again. You have to cope with it now. You have to do something now. The second quote, that you should not attach too much weight to matters which are very uncertain, basically says that of course you have to look ahead in planning, but you can overdo focusing on the long run. So be modest, do no harm, take into account that in the long run we are all dead, and don't attach too much weight to matters which are very uncertain, are the first three principles. The next one is coming from Hazlitt. And basically from his little booklet, Economics in One Lesson. And basically what he says there is, look beyond the immediately visible impact of an action. So look beyond the immediate impact and also look beyond the visible impact. That means that you should always be prepared also for unintended consequences. And again, of course, then we are back again at what is characteristic of a complex adaptive system. That is that there are always surprises, which is very much linked also to unintended consequences. Fifth and final principle, there are always trade-offs. There are no free lunches. To achieve something, you always have to give up something else which you cannot achieve. And this is a principle that comes from, again, an economist, Milton Friedman. So I've given 5 strengths and I've given 5 principles. And what is needed is that you have to develop these strengths and you have to act according to these principles to be effective in today's but also tomorrow's world as it is. These 5 principles and 5 strengths provide an interesting basis for discussing, and I also believe criticizing, several of the current policies that we see in the world, and for criticizing and discussing several crucial problems that the world is facing at the moment. I would have loved, for example, to discuss climate policy from this perspective. I would have loved to have discussed policies of central banks like the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank from this perspective, or financial regulation. Unfortunately, that is not possible given my time constraints. So let me just mention a couple of points about ECB policy in particular. I do think that if you look at current policies from the European Central Bank, that you could argue that is a policy that is violating the first 2 policy principles that I mentioned. The ECB policy is not modest. Why not? Because the ECB has set a very precise target for inflation, 1.8% or 1.9% per year. And that's simply something that you cannot achieve in a complex world. It is also violating the do no harm principle. It is buying huge amounts of government debt via this so-called QE program in order to bring inflation to the level of 1.8, 1.9% that I mentioned earlier. Current inflation is around 0.5% point lower than what the ECB tries to achieve. That in itself doesn't do a lot of harm, but the policies that the ECB is following, these QE policies, are quite risky. They have a lot of risks in themselves. They may create another financial crisis. They lead to postponement of adjustments by governments. They may hamper growth. They may trigger inflation at a certain point in time. Quite large risks. And you take these risks apparently only to increase the actual inflation by a couple of tens of percentage points. So I have the feeling that the ECB is indeed in such a complex system as the European economy is indeed doing more harm than good and violating that important principle of policy in a complex system. There's much more to say about central bank policy, and certainly also, of course, about the other policies that I mentioned, like climate policy. But I think I have to leave that potentially to the panel discussion later on in this seminar. So let me conclude by wishing you not only an enjoyable but also a fruitful seminar and also ball tomorrow. And thank you for your attention.